I want you all to do me a favor and raise your hand if you've ever had a loved one who has suffered from a disease such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, heart disease, or perhaps even go through a life-changing accident that has caused paralyzation. Now you see, that's a significant amount of people who just raised their hands there, and who would ever wish upon such hardships to their loved ones? Well, the reality is no one would. So what if I told you that there was a treatment out there that could help heal these unfortunate diseases and injuries? Embryonic stem cells made a huge breakthrough in the 90s, but many consider them to be morally and ethically unjust, thus provoking the remarkable discovery of induced pluripotent stem cells, also known as iPS cells, which is what I'll be talking about today in my speech. As a third-year biology major, I am very fascinated by the world of scientific discoveries that aim to benefit humanity. And after reading countless articles in academic journals, I am prepared to talk to you upon the subject of induced pluripotent stem cells. Now, in my speech, I hope to talk to you about iPS cells, discussing how they are created, their significance to society, and their current uses within the medical field. I myself had not heard of iPS cells until a few months ago, so let's begin by talking about how they are created. But before we dive into how these iPS cells are created, I want to break down the meaning of this term we will be hearing a lot about today. This term is induced pluripotent stem cells. So what does each word in that mean? Give it a thought, but don't worry, I'll explain it to you shortly. So the first three main steps in creating these induced pluripotent stem cells is first going to be the use of 4 specific reprogramming genes, which were discovered by a scientist by the name of Shinya Yamanaka, which are introduced to adult skin or blood cells using viruses. Now these viruses take the specific reprogramming genes and enter the cell, similar to how a virus infects a cell with a common sickness. Now, once the genes enter the cell, they're going to create these proteins, and the proteins enter the cell's nucleus and act on the DNA of the cell. This causes the cell DNA to convert the cells into a pluripotent state. Now, a pluripotent state means that a cell can now regenerate into any type of cell it wants to be. So step 2 is iPS cells are going to be cultivated and grown in thin layers in a lab setting. iPS cells are watched closely to ensure the proper proliferation and growth of themselves. And it's important to note that this process isn't happening overnight, but instead over the course of numerous weeks. Now, the third and final step of creating these iPS cells is once they are created and grown successfully, they are ready for experimental use. iPS cells can be injected or implanted into certain regions of the body to instigate the growth of new cells. Now, the process of creating these iPS cells may sound very complicated, but that's okay, frankly, because it is a complicated process. But to help you understand it a bit more, let's review the words induced pluripotent stem cells and what they mean. So, adult skin or blood cells are going to be induced / influenced by one of the certain reprogramming genes that are introduced, and it's going to turn the cell into a pluripotent state, meaning that they now have the ability to regenerate into any type of cell they could ever want to be. And now this is similar to how a stem from a plant is able to branch out their leaves in any kind of direction they like. Thus, the word stem cells is born. So now that we have a better understanding of how these induced pluripotent stem cells are made, let me explain why they are so significant to stem cell research and society overall. So stem cell research was and still is a debatable topic since the day it was discovered. How many of you just saw the Proposition 14 on this year's ballot when filling it out? Well, it proposes to authorize a $5.5 billion in state bonds to go to funding stem cell research and other medical research, which is huge. That being said, I want to now talk to you about the significance of iPS cells and the positives it can bring through being a more ethical approach to stem cell research and kickstarting many futuristic advancements in society. To begin, iPS cells are ethically more reasonable than the use of embryonic stem cells. The derivation of iPS cells do not require the destruction of embryos to obtain these stem cells. Thus, iPS cells avoid the ethical dilemma of messing with an early human life form, as discussed by Takahashi and his team-written journal discussing the ethics of iPS cells. iPS cells don't require the production of embryos. Instead, they are derived from the basic skin and blood cells of adult organisms. Second reason why iPS cells are significant is it opens a world of futuristic possibilities and technologies known to many. In their published scientific journal, Straighten and his team discuss the use of derived iPS cells and their aid to wildlife conservation, stating how gametes of various species have been produced from these iPS cells, including birds, mouses, cats, etc., and then implanted into a female surrogate to produce healthy, functioning offspring. With success like this, scientists believe that iPS cells could drastically be used to help endangered species produce offspring if need be. Now, in the same journal, Stratton and his team discuss the future of cell-based meat, which is pretty cool. Now, recently, new companies like Memphis Meats, which are based in the Bay Area here in California, have entered the race to produce meat from these induced pluripotent stem cells. Memphis Meats' mission is to produce delicious, healthy meats that are brought to your table by harvesting it from cells rather than animals. So such an advancement could stop the slaughtering of millions of animals for food and reduce global warming effects, as it would cut down on the effects of land, water, and waste that is generated typically from livestock farming. Now, iPS cells, having just been discovered in 2007, have already made so many advancements in science and technology, from creating a more ethical route than embryonic stem cells to opening a world of endless possibilities that can overall benefit our society. So that's just a list, just a few of the many reasons why iPS cells are so significant. And lastly, I'd like to talk to you about my third and final point, which is how iPS cells are currently used within the medical field. Now, before I discuss that, I want you to quickly shout out how many cells you think there are in the human body. Alright, good. Those are some good guesses. So now, I actually don't know the answer to this. Probably should have looked that up beforehand. Nah, I'm just playing with you. The answer is going to be, there's 200 different types of cells located in the human body, which is pretty incredible to think about. So, that being said, iPS cells are used in so many different variations because they have the ability to convert into literally any of the 200 cells located in our bodies. So let me tell you how iPS cells have recently been used in the medical field, helping treat things like Parkinson's disease, spinal cord injuries, Alzheimer's, and even heart disease. iPS cells have been playing a critical role in cell-based treatments for diseases such as Parkinson's, which is a neurodegenerative disease that severely affects a person's daily life from losing key motor functions. Now, a study published in 2017 by Kikuchi and his colleagues has shown positive responses to primate models, aka monkeys, with Parkinson's disease after introducing dopaminergic neurons derived from induced pluripotent stem cells. After the success of this clinical trial, the scientists from Japan would like to replicate a similar trial but on human models instead, given they can get approval from local legislation. Conducting such an experiment would take lots of time, money, and potential risk, but finding a cure for Parkinson's disease would immensely help the 10 million people that currently suffer from it around the world, according to the Parkinson's Foundation in 2018. Studies like the one performed by Nagoshi and his team have also used IPS as a form of cell therapy with treating spinal cord injuries in animals. Now, the study conducted by the team described how neural precursor cells are generated from these induced pluripotent stem cells and are able to synthesize new neurons in our body that reintroduce synaptic connections in the axons that are located in the spinal cord. Last but not least, iPS cells have been used to treat common things like Alzheimer's and heart disease. Now, iPS cells can be used for another method known as disease modeling, helping find answers for diseases such as for diseases such as Alzheimer's. This is discussed by Heiko Bark in his published article, stating that many mechanisms that cause Alzheimer's are still unknown, and iPS cells derived from the patients with this disease could greatly help answer these unknown questions. So furthermore, iPS cells have been used to help patients with heart disease. In 2018, a team led by Osaka University cardiac surgeon Yoshiki Sawa in Japan were granted permission to run a clinical trial on human patients using iPS cells to restore injured hearts. These implanted cells seem to interact with the patient's heart, either growing as new heart-beating cells or secreting beneficial factors that help the pre-existing cells of the patient. You hear about these people who get into freak accidents or develop diseases, and just like that, their life can change in a snap. It's truly remarkable to see the different ways that iPS cells could help these same people recover and live a happy life. Treatment for Parkinson's, spinal cord injuries, Alzheimer's, and heart disease are just some of the many sectors in health that iPS cells can play a role in helping. In conclusion, I have talked about iPS cells, discussing how they are created, their significance to society, and their current uses within the medical field. Since their remarkable discovery in 2007, iPS cells have instilled a lot of hope for society, from creating a more ethical approach to stem cell research to discovering hundreds upon hundreds of new technologies and techniques that can be used to solve many issues. With this speech, I hope to have brought you some new knowledge that is both eye-opening and inspiring. With all the negatives the year 2020 has brought so far, it has been really great to see that scientists around the world are making so much headway in areas that I had no idea were even possible. It makes me realize how strong our people can be when we come together to achieve something. In fact, I look at all of you right now and see all the bright minds that will one day come together in their own unique way to help improve society, just like induced pluripotent stem cells have contributed recently. Thank you for listening.